Alright, welcome back, Matt here. Today I wanted to show you how we're doing grass. And I know this is not necessarily very novel or unique, but there's a couple tricks to optimizing it, and the material I'm using is maybe a little bit, I guess, advanced, so I just kind of wanted to show it off a little bit. So there's basically three parts to how grass works. There's a mesh, which is just copied a bunch of times. There's the material, which does fanciness like wind, and then there's the foliage instances, foliage tool here. If at all possible, to begin with, I don't recommend doing grass this densely, other than maybe for some high graphics presets, some cutscenes. If I hit play and I take a look at shader complexity by hitting F5, it is not great, to say the least. And that's just because it's drawing so many layers of transparency on top of each other. I mean, I'm still hitting, 80, 90 FPS, and my frame time is not bad or anything, but on a lower-end machine, this is not going to be great, and you probably want to save your really heavy-hitting effects, your kind of shader complexity and stuff for things like trees and maybe some more important effects. So if at all possible, I'd recommend you get a nice ground material, hopefully one that looks a little better than this. And just use kind of grass and foliage and flowers as little bits of kind of brush and clumps. That's kind of the standard way to do it. You can totally do this, and I'll show you some tricks to optimize it. The real killer is lighting. This grass is not lit at all, or not that it's not lit, but it doesn't cast shadows at all. And there's some tricks to optimizing it and reducing pop in and out. But let's just kind of jump right in. I'll show you the mesh. The general standard way to do this mesh is just to do kind of 4 planes. 1, 2, 3, 4. If I remove this material, and actually I'm going to change it to a 2-sided one just because I know I have one here. What you'll notice is that we've got these 4 planes. I also rotated a little bit just so that when you look at it from the top down like this, you aren't missing, you don't just see straight through to the bottom. You don't really need to do any level of detail setup on grass. There's some shenanigans with foliage in that this is all the same instance, and so it's all going to use the same level of detail anyway. I think just because it was easy, this one reduces the number of tries by a half when I get too far away, but it's not really so important for grass as much as other types of foliage like trees. So we've got our static mesh. Next we need a grass texture with an alpha. You can get one of these just by Googling grass texture or grass alpha, and something like this works great. You want something that's pretty square, that the grass fills up most of the texture, or that you can crop so that it exists like that. You don't want something with edges like this, or you'll see those when you place them into the world, and you also don't want something that kind of tapers too much. You want it to be pretty square, otherwise when you put it in, you'll notice some kind of clumping and tiling. The big kicker is how much transparent area it has to draw. So reducing that as much as possible by having the grass fill up as much of the area as it can helps increase efficiency. You can kind of make a trade-off between shader complexity and the number of tries that you have to draw by, for example, instead of modeling it as just planes, you could actually model it with a higher vertex count, but to reduce transparency overdraw, even to the point of modeling individual blades and then spawning those in as foliage. And you'd get much better shader complexity that way, although you'd have many more tries to draw at any given time. And that's a trade-off you may want to make, so you can try to optimize that however you see fit. But the general standard way to do it is just with 3 or 4 planes and using the UVs such that the grass takes up as much of the area as possible to reduce overdraw. So with that in mind, let's dive into the material. I'm using a texture that an artist drew. Looks like this. It's kind of stylized. Note that it's not not a proper alpha mask. You kind of have three things to think about. There's opaque, translucent, and masked materials. Opaque being no translucency. It's the least expensive, rendering-wise. Translucent will be the most expensive, and you can have any amount of translucency. You can have fully opaque bits, fully translucent bits, or partially translucent bits. It's things like frosted glass that are a little bit translucent. There's kind of a middle ground. Masked materials are very cheap to render on the parts that are opaque, and the trade-off is that they don't have, it's either fully opaque or fully translucent. And so what it'll do to an alpha like this is just kind of pick a threshold, and then anything higher than that is translucent, and anything lower is opaque. It ends up working out pretty well with this. But yours might just be, if you look at the alpha channel, it might just be full black and white, which is a true alpha mask. So I'll start by making a material here. I'll just call it grass matte, doesn't really matter. And I can pull it up, and I can go to my textures and drag my grass texture in there. So out of this material, we want it to show a grass with translucent background. We want it to be two-sided. We want it to add wind, and we're going to want to fake a little bit of shadow detail on here. So to do that, this is a surface material. It's masked. You can use a default lit, and that might work. In fact, it will be more efficient for what I'm doing to use default lit because there's no shadow information anyway. You can use subsurface, and that means that if you shine a light from behind it, a little bit of that light will get through. If you imagine a real life shining a flashlight through a leaf, you would see a little bit of brightness through it, and so the light isn't fully occluded, and that's what subsurface means. I can actually hold L and click in this viewport to change the light direction, and if you notice I go behind it and none of it gets through this material, that's because it's not subsurface. You can also, what we're going to use is two-sided foliage, which is basically subsurface. And we are going to set it to two-sided, and that's pretty easy. So with that, the simplest way to do this would just be to connect base color and opacity mask. And we've got grass, easy peasy. We do want a couple things. We're going to make this pretty heavily parameterized so that you can tweak stuff. It's common for you to pull grass into the world and then it doesn't quite match the color of the ground, so we want to be able to tint it. There's a couple of considerations with tinting, which is how much of the original color gets in, and then how much of your tint color gets in. So to control the original color, we're actually going to desaturate this base color, which by default will just make it grayscale. But you can use a parameter for this fraction. We're going to hold S and click to get a scalar parameter, and this is going to be desaturation amount. I'm going to default it to like 0.1. There we go. Okay, so we can control the desaturation. We also want to be able to control how much tint gets in. I'm going to hold V and get a vector parameter. This is going to be our tint. And I'm going to default it to like a nice green. Doesn't really matter. And to add that tint in, we're going to use a lerp. And we're going to lerp by holding L and clicking between the desaturated color of our texture and the tint color, and the alpha is going to be some other scalar parameter. I'm going to hold S and click, and this is going to be tint amount. Default maybe 0.2. That ought to do. And if I plug this in, then we're going to be tinting by some amount. That's pretty heavy. Another thing is that this is going to be inverted, so that a value of 1 is going to be no tint, and a value of 0 is going to be full tint, and we'd like the opposite of that, so I'm just going to do 1 minus here, just to correct that. So now that if I set this to 0.2, it'll kind of be inverted from what it was before. Okay, that should do it. Now we can tint it however we want. I'm going to make things a little easier here, and I'm going to hold 1 and drag a constant in for metallic, because that's never going to change. And I'm going to get 2 more scalar parameters, one for specularity and one for roughness. Specularity is going to be maybe 0.1 by default out of 1, and roughness oops, roughness and specularity. And I'm going to drag these up just to get them out of the way. Another thing is to don't be afraid to use these groups. This is just kind of what category in the UI it puts stuff in, but I can name this like parameters and put those there. I might put this into color and then put desaturation amount and tint amount into color. The other thing we do before wind is that we're going to want to do the subsurface. That's pretty easy. We're going to use another copy of this texture sample. You could just plug this right in. But once again, we kind of want to be able to control on the fly how much subsurface information there is. That's really easy. We just multiply this by some constant. Another scalar parameter. This one's going to be subsurface amount. I'm going to default it to like 0.4. And I might put this into parameters as well. There we go. And now you'll notice that if I take the light by holding L and I move it behind, that a little bit of it gets through. That's exactly what we want. Okay, the last thing we need to do is worry about wind. And we're going to use this world position offset for that. I'm going to move some of this out of the way. So this is actually really easy thanks to the simple grass wind node. This is going to require some parameters, and we can just plug that into world position offset. I'm going to get 4 scalars, once again, for each one of these. Wind intensity, maybe 0.5. Wind weight, I don't know, what do I have here, 0.5. Wind speed, maybe I'll make that 0.5. I think in my other material I had this at 0.7. Doesn't really matter. And then this is just additional offset. 0.2. You can use whatever values you want, and it's worth knowing that you can change these on the fly. You could even have them controlled by something like a if you had a windsock in here, you could control the strength of the wind with that gust. You can't really control the direction through this, but if you had a storm coming in or something, you could increase the wind on the grass, that kind of thing. And you notice that, well, it is waving, and that's pretty good. There's a couple problems here. One is that we haven't yet included any kind of baked-in lighting information into this material, and the other is that it's kind of waving all the way across. It's waving down here at the bottom too. Also worth noting that you get a little bit higher resolution kind of waviness if you subdivide your planes, which you might want to do if you're not doing grass this densely, but instead just having some clumps. So keep that in mind. One more thing I'm going to do here is actually just put these into a little category called wind, just to make things a little bit easier. And the sort priority will determine where in that list they show up. Otherwise, they'll just be alphabetical. So I'll make it so that they show up in this kind of order. Colors, I want this to be first, and then we'll do desaturation and tint. And then for parameters, we'll start with, say, subsurface amount, and then we'll go specularity and roughness. That'll do it. So we wanted to apply wind at the top and not the bottom. And the easy way to do that is to take a linear gradient. I'm going to pull in a multiply just to kind of preview this. We want a vertical gradient, which looks a little something like this. But we also want it upside down because we want 0 at the bottom and 1 at the top. And that's easy to do. We just do 1 minus. Bink. And that'll invert it. And we're not actually going to multiply. We want to kind of make this more intense so that you get a little bit more drastic fade, and I'm going to use a power for that. I think what I've seen done is to use like 1.6, and also worth noting is I'm pulling a lot of this material stuff from a couple of YouTube tutorials that I'll also have linked if you want their original source. You could also control this via a parameter, and that would control kind of strength of the wind as well as strength of the shadow. So this is what that looks like. And if I literally just multiply the grass wind by this, plug that into world position offset, you'll see that we get wind just the way we want it. None at the bottom and some wind at the top. And that's perfect. Since this is a gradient from black to white, we can kind of use this to control that shadow we wanted too. We don't want like full black at the bottom, and so we're going to offset this by a little bit by just adding maybe something like 0.2 or 0.3. And that'll look something like this, and maybe 0.2. And this is going to take the black and pull it up a little bit. It's also going to take the white and pull it over 1, and so we have to clamp that back down between 0 and 1 so that we don't blow it out. And if I take that and I multiply the output of all this by that, and I use that as base color, then we're going to cheat some of this shadow information back in. It's not a lot, but it's subtle and it'll help. Might lower that even more. Okay, this is extremely ugly at the moment. I apologize. You're going to want to kind of organize things and use comment bubbles and all that good practice stuff. I'm just going to leave it as this spaghetti mess so that we can save you some time here. Another thing to consider, grass is going to be a really pretty expensive thing. And so you may want to include some options for graphic settings. One thing that you should be aware of is there's a couple types of switches. There's a feature level switch, and this will change how this material renders depending on what kind of graphics engine we're using. Whether we're using like DirectX 11:10.9 or mobile or that kind of thing. So if you're planning for different hardware, you may want to just hardware, or you'll be able to kind of predict what graphics capabilities they'll be able to have. So you might want to plug things into this if you wanted to change feature levels based on things like DirectX 11 versus 10 or that kind of thing. What I would recommend is you use a quality switch so that you can plug different materials essentially into low, medium, and high. You might want low to not run this whole wind and linear gradient effect and just use a mask material. You're also probably going to want to have low, medium, and high control density of foliage, or whether it exists at all, that kind of thing. So, but you can just keep in mind that you can use these. But this is the finished material, fully kind of parameterized to be tweakable just the way you want it. If I go into this grass and I make this grass matte and save, and we're actually going to want to make that a material instance. Where did I save you? Then we have grass. And, you know, right off the bat, you might notice that it doesn't quite have the right color for the ground it's on, so you can pull this up and override the tint and make that more yellow, and that looks good. You might lower or raise the desaturation amount, tint amount maybe 0.4. Yeah, that's helping. Subsurface amount we might up. And then you can change wind speed and all of that. Easy peasy. We've got some nice grass. So that's part 2 of 3. Part 3 of 3 is getting the foliage set up, and this is where kind of the optimization is going to come into effect. So what I'm going to do actually is take this foliage actor, just delete it, and then in my meshes foliage, I think I had some stuff set up here I'm going to delete. Maybe I need to delete them. Well, no. You guys should be deletable. Maybe I have to save the level first. Yeah, there we go. So, the easy way to do this is just to take this mesh with its material applied and drag and drop it into foliage, and now you can paint it. Wow, grass. This is a little big, and we're going to want to change some settings. So, click on this. It tells what mesh it's going to use, the density per 1,000 by 1,000 area. Let's see, I mean, you can crank this really high, and then the kind of minimum distance between them. This is more important for things like trees where you don't want trunks to intersect and that sort of stuff. And then how it scales. You might want to have trees scaled to be taller but not wider, in which case you might change this. Grass, it doesn't really matter, it's just 2D planes anyway, so this grass mesh is a little big on imports, so I'm going to lower it to like 0.33 to 0.4, I think is working pretty well. You can have like a minimum and maximum offset from where it starts just to give some variation, so I might do like, I don't know, -3 to 0. We do want it to align to normal so that if I painted it onto this surface, it will align to it rather than facing straight up. You might want trees to work a little bit differently. And we do want to give it maybe some random angles, maybe something like 4 degrees pitch and yaw. You can set kind of the minimum and maximum ground slope that you can paint this on. You wouldn't want grass to be growing off of walls or cliffs. And you can set kind of minimum and maximum height that this foliage can even exist at. This would be more prevalent for things like you can set your landscape material up in such a way that it will automatically put grass foliage onto your grass brush. And that's pretty cool, but you might want that to only happen at certain altitudes, and you can set that here. You can also set landscape layers that you're even allowed to paint this onto. You can check it to check for collision with world before placing. We're not going to need to do that. You've got instance settings. You probably want to leave this at static for speed. I can see some instances where you might want trees that would be like able to be cut down, or you might want them to be movable. The important settings that we're going to play with for optimization are going to be shadows and cold distance. If you don't have a cold distance, then if I just like covered this in 400,000 instances of grass, then it's going to have to render every one of those all the time, and that's going to kill things. But you really can only see in a certain radius around you, and when things get far away, you don't really need it to render the grass. So cold distance is going to be the minimum and maximum distance before it will delete grass instances. General, like, I don't know, maybe between 1,000 and 8,000 would be pretty good here. The other thing is shadows, and this is just kind of a consideration you have to make. In our little prototype, we have a day-night cycle, and when it becomes dawn and dusk, it'd be really nice to have some nice, like, long shadows cast. But not all grass needs dynamic shadows. If I crank the density up and start painting grass here, this stuff doesn't really need dynamic shadows. And in fact, the way we've designed the material, an efficiency trade-off we can make is to not even have it cast static shadows. We fake some shadow information in the material. Maybe you add a landscape layer that's a darker version of this to kind of fake ground shadow, and then all of a sudden you don't even have to rebuild lighting. Because if you have 10,000, 50,000 grass instances in your level and you build lighting, it's almost certainly going to throw you a warning about light map UVs being too large, which is just a warning, but it'll take a long, long time to build lighting. And, you know, that's okay if that's what you want, but there's just some optimization trade-offs to make. So, I mean, you can crank this to 2,000 if you feel like it and really paint some grass. And it's very dense, looks very nice, the way we've got it set up. Another thing is that if I paint a bunch of grass and then I zoom very far away, you notice how it just kind of clips out at chunks like this? You know, that's probably fine. If you have a lot of grass, one thing you can do is to save this as a foliage asset. I've got a foliage folder here, and I might call this like F grass 1. And then you have settings for this. I'll probably lower the density to something like 250. And what we're going to do is, first of all, I'm going to set this to not even cast shadows. No shadows. And you notice now that when I place it into the world, I no longer have to rebuild lighting, and I haven't even gotten any real quality losses. What we're going to do is make copies of this. I'm going to drag another one in here, and I'm going to save it out as foliage F grass 2. And this one's going to be the same sort of settings, except different cold distance, maybe something like 250 to 2,000. So that when I'm standing really near the grass, it's very dense, but it lowers density farther away. No shadows. Higher density, maybe a distance apart. We'll change its size settings, placement settings, angle settings to be identical. That looks good. Another thing is that if you are doing lighting, this will use the default static meshes light map resolution, but for foliage you probably want it lower. The minimum you can go to is 4, and in some cases you won't even notice a quality decrease. You'll just have to check. If you want thick grass, you probably don't want collision. There are some instances where, especially for trees, you'd want it to use some collision preset. And you can have it do things like receive decals and that sort of thing. So now I've got 2 of these, and I'm going to make one more. I'm going to save this as F grass 3. And really, really quickly going to enter some of the same settings. Let's see, give it some angle alignments. That ought to do it. Cull distance maybe 4,000 to 6,500. Don't cast any shadows. Lower the light map resolution. Okay. So now if I'm painting all 3 of these, then I'm painting 3 different types of grass with different cull distances. And that means that when I zoom out, it lowers in density first before clipping away, and that can kind of reduce this pop-in. Another reason you might want to do this is that if I wanted some shadows, some dynamic shadows on the edges of a grass field, then I might want to have one of these that does cast dynamic shadows, painted along the edges, and then it'll have shadows where they're important but not where they're unimportant, just to save on optimization. So I can paint these. I've tested this. I've painted 100,000 in here, and basically whenever it's within full cull distance of the camera, like an 8,000 by 8,000 circle here, I still hit pretty reasonable frame rates in Engine. So it's something that you could do if this was your effect you wanted and you were very careful about optimization in other areas. Then I see no reason why you couldn't have some really nice full fields of grass. You just have to be careful with optimizing it. So that's basically that. There's very little else to do with foliage here. You also are going to want to check this enable density scaling down here. This will enable the kind of density of foliage to be controlled by the engine's graphics scaling. Partly so that when you send this Unreal project to your developer buddy who's on a MacBook Pro, then he can go into the render settings and change them, and then it will lower the amount of foliage that's rendered. But also so that in-game, lower graphics presets will have lower or 0 foliage density. So that's how we're doing grass. It looks nice to stand in. You're going to want to have some other types, some little flowers and stuff that you can scatter around. Play with the foliage tools. A couple days here I'll probably have another little tutorial out about trees, how to generate them, how to do levels of detail for them. There's a lot of shenanigans in terms of optimization there too, so tune back in, and thanks for sitting all the way through this.